Up until the presidential election of 2000 between George Walker Bush and Albert Gore Jr., there had never been an election so close, with the exception of the election of 1876 between Hayes and Tilden. What sets the 2000 election apart from others was the combination of many things, namely a lack of standardized voting methods, which resulted in a pretty messy tabulation of votes across the country. This poor tabulation method resulted in a string of events regarding the election, all the way from protests to a United States Supreme Court case. The election of 2000 brought up many issues with the country's voting system and still has many questioning its fairness today. Despite the legitimacy of past elections in the United States history, the election of 2000 is still being debated to this day regarding its legitimacy. The election was unique in how close it was. It was so close, in fact, that even a full day after Election Day, November 7, 2000, neither candidate had reached the 270 electoral votes minimum required to become president-elect. The one state whose race had not been called at that point was, of course, the state of Florida. Florida was somewhat of a swing state at that point, generally favoring the conservative candidate, but sometimes swinging for the liberal candidate. This trend towards conservatism in Florida ultimately pushed George Bush one electoral vote over the threshold for the 270 electoral votes necessary to become president-elect, but not without a good deal of scrutiny and unrest among both parties. Because the difference in votes between Gore and Bush was so slim, about 2,000 votes, Florida state law automatically required a machine recount of votes. On November 8th, the machine recount was complete, and this placed Gore within about 300 votes of Bush's numbers. At this point in the election cycle, Gore requested another recount, though this time exclusively in counties Volusia, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade. Side note, this recount sparked a lot of outrage on behalf of both parties. Protests broke out all across the nation. Stemming from unrest among both Gore and Bush supporters, these protests were widespread and influential. With the turn of the century only furthering advancements in the media and entertainment sector, these protests found their way onto screens all across the country and even in many other countries as well. Then Secretary of State Katherine Harris approved the recount, but only if previously mentioned counties submitted 100% of their recounted votes by 5 p.m. on November 14th. After some pushback, the Florida State Supreme Court agreed to extend that deadline to November 26th. During this time, Miami-Dade County essentially gave up in trying to recount its votes, resubmitting its initial recount.
We could not, given our best efforts of this board, the best efforts of the county, the best efforts of all these people sitting here, complete the manual recount the way we've been doing it, even adding more tables, adding more staff. We could not do it by the deadline.
After Palm Beach County completed its recount, it was 2 hours past the 5 p.m. deadline, and Harris rejected its outcome. Even after all of that, Bush was still winning in the state, and the state canvassing board certified the results. Gore then proceeded to formally challenge the results, requesting about 70,000 bad votes to be recounted. The request was denied by a state court, then the decision was reversed by the Florida Supreme Court on December 7th, and it was ordered that the 70,000 undervotes were to be recounted. An undervote is a vote that was not able to be fully counted due to user or machine error, most commonly as a result of a lack of selection on the ballot. The following day, on December 8th, after request by the Bush campaign, the United States Supreme Court halted that recount based on a writ of certiorari on the grounds that the counting of votes that are of questionable legality threatens irreparable harm to petitioner, and a recount would cast a needless and unjustified cloud upon Bush's public image. And that was the move that opened the Bush versus Gore United States Supreme Court case. This decision, while enacted on December 8th, was officially decided on the 12th in a 5-4 vote in Bush's favor, halting the vote on the grounds that the vote tabulation method in Florida violated the Equal Protection Clause. The specific law that the Supreme Court was called upon to interpret whether Florida, with its evident lack of consistent standards for voting across its counties, was in violation of the Constitutional Amendment 14, Section 1, the Equal Protection Clause, which states, "No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." The outcome of the case resulted in the official stopping of a vote recount in Florida, thus handing the election to George W. Bush. It is my opinion that it was a grossly and absolutely unacceptable outcome of Bush v. Gore. The Supreme Court's job as the judicial branch of the government is to interpret the laws and decide a punishment according to the severity of the crime. The law that was stated to have been violated, that no state is permitted to restrict the rights of a person operating within their jurisdiction, relating to Florida's apparent lack of voting standard per county, has no application to the issue at hand. If anything, it would be a further violation of said clause to declare that only the votes that had been counted thus far were valid, essentially dumping the rest regardless of anything. One could also argue that due to the safe harbor deadline, it would have been pointless to allow a recount because said deadline only allows for electors to be appointed by a certain date and within a certain amount of time after the vote is certified. And at that point, the deadline was decided to be on January 12, 2000, the day the court case was decided. Gore's lawyers argued that, despite the evident issues within the state's voting tabulation methods, the vote of the persons of Florida was counted by voter intent, or in other words, even though the voting was a mess, it's more reasonable to count as many valid votes as possible rather than giving up and keeping the original, and mind you, very flawed outcome of the Florida vote. However, that still begs the question, why do I disagree that Florida violated the Equal Protection Clause? Well, to me it's quite simple. While a violation of the Equal Protection Clause certainly could apply to Florida, so does it also to quite literally every single other state at the time. Plain and simple, no other state in that election had a standard of voting method, the issue Florida was being targeted over. I believe that due to the closeness of the election in the state of Florida, the Supreme Court made an explicitly partisan decision in ruling against Gore, which consequently handed the victory to George Bush. Not only did the Supreme Court grossly fail in its responsibility as the judicial branch, so also were the rights violated of the voters in Florida whose votes were practically ignored due to the prompt halt in any and all recounts taking place in Florida. Had every single vote been counted, it appears that Al Gore would have won the state based on the NORC-sponsored Florida Ballot Project recount, in which the organization analyzed 61,190 undervotes, ballots with no specified choice, and 113,820 overvotes, ballots with multiple candidates selected. Of all the disputed votes counted, 68,476 chose Gore, and 23,591 chose Bush. Based on further research conducted by the National Opinion Research Center, it was concluded that if the disputed votes during the cycle were all to have been properly counted and included with the certification of the state's results, the electoral result would have been reversed and Gore would have won the state by between 60 and 170 votes, and thus the election as well. However, it is worth mentioning that the Florida state legislature had been planning on sending electors for Bush regardless of the outcome of the state's opinion. Given that the governor of Florida at the time was George Bush's brother and the Secretary of State was a campaign advisor for Bush, who herself has been involved in plenty of controversies, there was almost certainly an ulterior motive within the state of Florida regarding the outcome. It also goes without saying that the nation preferred Al Gore over George Bush, having won the popular vote by over 500,000 votes. But that's a different subject for a different day. This election was the closest electoral race since 1876 and the third closest popular vote margin between candidates running for president, with the final victory in Florida only allowing Bush a 537-vote lead over Gore, out of 5.8 million cast, or 0.009%. The closeness of this election could not be emphasized enough. Once again, within the country's electoral college before the race was called, neither candidate had enough votes to win, and within Florida, the deciding state, the votes were closer than ever thought possible. The significance of this election and court case cannot be overstated. The Bush v. Gore decision literally was responsible for choosing the 43rd president, and that in and of itself is pretty significant without weighing in the differences in policy between the two candidates. Had this court case ruled in a different direction, many things today could be significantly different. George W. Bush was president during the wars in the Middle East, during Hurricane Katrina, and not to mention during the September 11th terrorist attacks, and who knows what different directions these situations could have gone in had Gore been the president. We can rest easy on issues like these today, however, given that Florida has since retired the unreliable punch card voting system that was possibly the only reason George Bush became the nation's 43rd president. Now all we have to think about is super important issues like illegal aliens getting trans operations in prison and Haitian immigrants eating cats, dogs, and geese in Springfield, Ohio.